Thank you to General Allen and to Secretary McAleenan for the important discussion we just heard. I'm Susan Hennessy. I'm a senior fellow here at the Brookings Institution and the executive editor of Lawfare, and I will be moderating this panel today. Before I introduce our panelists, we'll remind everybody that we're doing the same note card procedure, so please just, if you have any notes for the panel, write down your name, your affiliation, your question, and who it's directed to, and just pass it to the end, and somebody from Brookings will collect it, and we will address all of those at the end. And I'll give a brief reminder whenever we have sort of last call for questions. I will briefly introduce my fellow panelists now. You all have their very impressive and very long biographies in your printed material, so I will give a very brief snapshot of those biographies. So next to me is Chad Wolf, who's the senior official performing the duties of the Undersecretary and the Assistant Secretary for Strategy, Plans, Analysis, and Risk in the Office of Strategy, Policy, and Planning at the Department of Homeland Security. He's been with the Department of Homeland Security since 2007. Seamus Hughes is the Deputy Director of the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. He previously worked at the National Counterterrorism Center and was the Senior Counterterrorism Advisor for the Senate Homeland Security Committee. Past him is James Carafano, the Vice President at the Heritage Foundation's Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy and the E.W. Richardson Fellow. And past him is George Salim, the Senior Vice President of Programs at the Anti-Defamation League. He previously served as DHS's first Director of the Office for Community Partnerships and has served in the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations. So thank you all for being here today. To get things started, I will ask Undersecretary Wolf to share some prepared remarks as sort of his reflections on the strategy.
Let me first by thanking both Brookings and Heritage for hosting the event today. As well as my panelists. I get the privilege to talk up here, but I want to acknowledge all my fellow DHS folks that are in the audience. They are the ones that are doing this work, so I get to talk about it, but they actually do it. So it's a tremendous asset that they are here today. I'll touch on 3 points that sort of people have asked me over the last several weeks as we talk to folks about the strategic framework. What are the takeaways? What do you take away from this? So 3 points which the acting secretary hit on, but I think is important to sort of underscore. One is the evolving nature of the threat. So we've been focused as a department since the inception on international terrorism, on foreign terrorist organizations and the like, and how do we stop individuals from exploiting our trade, travel, and immigration systems. What we're seeing now is a change in a focus. We're starting to see a troubling rise in domestic terrorism-related events. And so what that requires is the department to shift its focus and its priorities as well. So that's sort of point number one. Point number two would be the targeted violence that the acting secretary talked about. I think that's an important point. A lot of our stakeholders are still very concerned about your traditional terrorism-related events, but they are also growing extremely concerned about our soft target attacks, mass shootings, whether they're at stadiums, nightclubs, schools, and perhaps those attacks aren't tied to any one ideology, but they're concerning nevertheless, and what are the tools and resources that our local communities need to protect themselves. So that's point number two. Point number three would be our prevention mission as a department. I don't think that's one that's well understood. I think most folks understand what the department does from an aviation security standpoint, from a targeting standpoint, as folks come into the country, maritime cargo, air cargo come in, sort of our traditional bread and butter counterterrorism efforts, but what's called out in the strategic framework and what I think is different than in years past, and what the acting secretary has really elevated is in the prevention space. And whether we talk about a whole of society or a whole of community approach, as well as working with our social media and internet providers, that's really the sort of the difference maker here. So those are the three big buckets I believe the acting secretary touched on. I would underscore each of those, and that's really what stands out in my mind with this strategic framework as versus others in the past.
So this is a really dense document, and I think we could have probably 5 different discussions for an hour about any one element of it. So to sort of kick us off, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to sort of share, you've had time to review this document and think about it a little bit, and so to ask each of you to share sort of what is your big takeaway, what did you, reading this, what was your sort of overriding reaction of what's important here? And George, maybe I'll start with you and we can move inward from there.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to all those at Brookings and Heritage for hosting this great event today, and for the department to facilitating this really collaborative engagement on such an important topic. So 3 quick points. The first is that I greatly appreciate both the document and the secretary specifically pointing out the fact that over the past decade, more American lives, murders and homicides in the United States, lives have been lost at the hands of domestic terrorists, individuals in this country, than have at the hands of foreign-inspired terrorist organizations. And that's such an important point that's both rooted in this document on page 8 and the Secretary spoke to explicitly. Second, the document points out, and as the Secretary mentioned also, the annual Homeland Security Threat Assessment. I think this is something that many advocacy organizations, scholars, think tanks, and American citizens find to be reassuring in the sense that the department is going to take stock for the nature of risk and threat across the country from a whole range of sources, not just from foreign terrorist organizations. And I think this is really an important element that has been one of the key missing nodes in our Homeland Security apparatus for some time. And third is the dynamic that the strategy calls out for community resilience and community partnerships. I mean, this is such an important statistic. As we know, in 2017, calendar year, we saw a 57% increase in anti-Semitic incidents across the United States. Calendar year 2018 was the 3rd highest year of anti-Semitic incidents across the country, and that's coupled with the Department of Justice and FBI's own data that shows a 17% increase in hate crime across the board, affecting all ethnic, religious, minority communities and protected classes in this country. So the state of Homeland Security is one that many communities across this country, Jewish, Muslim, Latinx, LGBTQ, and others, do not feel safe in their own homes. So as we start to think about implementing this framework of Homeland Security, it's critical to acknowledge the fear and anxiety that many communities feel when they pray at their house of worship or that they gather in their community centers across the country. And I think the acknowledgement of that in this strategy is an important element to start repairing much of the damage that has been inflicted on those communities in recent years.
Yeah, I think we absolutely disagree. I take a totally different interpretation of what's going on. First thing I want to say is thank you for Brookings for co-hosting the event with the Heritage Foundation. And I did want to say, Chad, the reason we did a report with CSIS, which was the first ones to recommend that we have an Undersecretary for Policy, so you're welcome. I don't think it actually reflects an evolution of the threat. The threat's changing. Threats always change. We can have a discussion on that. Be happy to do that. But what I do think it does is it reflects an evolution of the department, and one which arguably is constructive. And the reason for that is if you actually look at the functional elements of the department and you look at the statutory mission of the department, it was designed, and Homeland Security's main mission is to really deal with a transnational terrorist threat. And its instruments, its capabilities, its authorities are really designed to do that, and that's what it primarily does. And the reason why the transnational numbers are so low is because they're actually doing a pretty good job. Even if you look at domestically, where there are groups with transnational links, the value of DHS really is in that international role. So probably the most memorable is the Times Square bomber, that even though he was acted domestically, he was caught because of DHS because they flagged him as he tried to leave the country. Now, that doesn't mean there is no role for the Department of Homeland Security in dealing with domestic terrorism and its related cousin targeted violence. And I think the very strong analogy, the appropriate analogy, is the way we address disaster response. We have what's called in the United States all-hazard response, right? When there's a big disaster, FEMA shows up. And we had this big debate about whether FEMA should be in the department or not, because not everything that FEMA responds to is Homeland Security. So why isn't the Homeland Security Department? So some smart guy, which is remarkable that somebody in the Congress could be smart, said, look, when there's a disaster, we can't sit around and wait and say, okay, we got to figure out if this is another 9/11 or if this is a gasoline. You know, we've got to respond and save lives because that's the mission of public safety, and we'll sort the rest out later. So it only makes sense as we have one national disaster response system. And I think that's the right analogy for DHS. Although DHS is not really a domestic security agency and dealing with domestic terrorism is not really a DHS job, they have capabilities and instruments that are useful in in helping and supporting that because they're there for the baseline mission of the department. And similarly with targeted violence, we're not going to sit around when there's a mass shooting to say, okay, was he a crazy nut job or is he a left-wing terrorist or a right-wing terrorist? We're going to respond. And I think what the document reflects is and appropriately, and what we should focus on is the efficient use of DHS resources in support of public safety missions, because the real executors here are the state and local government. What DHS is really doing is applying support to the state and local governments, which really have that role. I just want to say one other thing just real quickly, which is, talk about the elephant in the room that we don't talk about. The problem with this issue and dealing with what's the public safety response is it's overlaid by a massive political debate, right? And let's be honest, everybody wants to politicize this issue, whether it's gun control, or we hate white supremacists and let's connect them with Republicans, or we hate left-wing politicians, so let's connect them with Antifa or whatever. And that, I think, is if we try to analyze what the department is and should be doing through our political agendas, which people are wanting to do, it does a great disservice to the instrument. And in turn, if the instrument tries to be tuned and tuning itself to account for what people politically want to do, we're not going to do good public safety. And so I applaud one key finding, which is we're not running around battling ideologies here, right? Which is not the department's mission. We're running around and we're operating in the public safety space, which is responding to acts, preventing acts, and I think that very clear line which we deal with, where there is the precursor of a crime, right? Where there's a clear logic intent to a crime that requires an intervention where you're providing resources and capabilities to jump in. And I think that's the sweet spot the department really needs to stay in.
Thank you. I'm going to be relatively short because I think the question and answer is going to lead to some interesting conversations. First of all, I want to commend DHS for a very broad and far-reaching comprehensive report and strategy. I think it covers a whole host of issues, and that's speaking to the mission that is DHS. My big takeaway of looking at this 30 pages was it's a radical shift. And in many ways, you saw kind of the holdover from the Obama administration in terms of efforts. But the inclusion of targeted violence is going to change the way the Department of Homeland Security operates. And I don't think we fully kind of get that. In fact, the strategy calls for definitions for targeted violence, but you're going to have to get the FBI and NCTC with their own authorities to sign on to that idea and look at that. That also means that the way you approach those issues can be radically different too. So if you're talking about terrorism prevention or countering violent extremism, we talk a lot about community resiliency, but the way you approach countering violent extremism for targeted violence is radically different than the way you would approach it for, say, jihadist-inspired terrorism. It's also radically different when you talk about domestic terrorism, right? You're not doing a roundtable with sovereign citizens telling them how wrong they are, right? And so they're going to have to shift the way they approach this in many ways. I do want to commend the department for the announcement of the annual Homeland Security Threat Assessment. I think that'll be helpful not only for academics but the public to get a full sense of, when we talk about international, domestic, targeted violence, what do the numbers look like? What does the threat look like? How does it change? And I think that responds to a lot of bills that we've seen in Congress, both on the Republican and Democratic side. And then finally, I'd mention. It's on page 24, so I don't want people to miss it. But there is a talk about recidivism in this. When you look at domestic terrorism and international terrorism, the prison sentences are getting increasingly shorter, and the programs in order to reintegrate these individuals back in is increasingly small too. And if terrorism is a form of crime, however abhorrent it is, you're going to see recidivism in any form of crime, and so they're going to have to wrap their head around that.
So that's all, I think, incredibly helpful framing, and sort of picking up on Seamus's last comment, and sort of for the first question for you. This word targeted violence, to sort of key in a little bit on the definitional stuff here. So this document uses the term domestic terrorism, uses this word targeted violence. That second one, I think, is a little bit less familiar to people. I understand It's not a brand new term, but it is a little bit new in this context. And so, let's drill down a little bit on what exactly are we talking about whenever you say targeted violence?
Sure. So it's not a new term, to your point. So DOJ has used it, Secret Service has used it for several years. So what we're talking about are acts of violence that are premeditated. So the venue or the place has been identified beforehand. I think the difference that we're talking about in differentiating targeted violence versus domestic terrorism is not tied to any one ideology. So it's individuals, again, mainly lone actors, but not always, are taking certain actions, some of which they leave manifestos, some they do not, that are targeting institutions in a way to make it look like a terrorist act. But again, I think the key that we focus on, again, at the department is it's not tied to any one ideology, is the key there. So when we look at domestic terrorism and we start looking at ethnic, racially motivated, anti-authority, anti-government, environmentalism, abortion, you can go down the list of a lot of ideologies that are tied to specific domestic terrorist events, and you can do the same on the international terrorism side. So what differentiates from a departmental perspective on targeted violence is just that. And again, a lot of the manifestos and information that's left behind point to that as well.
So George, you in your opening comments sort of touched on the surge and sort of number of essentially domestic threats we've seen, and that it actually outstrips sort of the foreign-inspired or foreign-connected threats in terms of actual impact here in the United States. Listening to this definition of targeted violence as being sort of untethered from ideology, does that reflect the actual threat that we're seeing? Is it sufficiently comprehensive? Is it over-inclusive? How does it sort of match with the threat landscape as you understand it?
So I think that the way that it's laid out in this framework meets or comes to pace with where the numbers we've seen over the past 24 or 36 months for the nature and scope of threats, whether they be, to Jim's point earlier, whether they be on the far left of the ideological spectrum, on the far right, of no ideological inspiration at all, that we can determine yet, like we saw in the Las Vegas country music concert shooting in the fall of 2017. And so I think the framework appropriately scopes that in a number of different ways. My contention would be that we've seen, and the security professionals and the analysts have seen this evolution over the past decade, and we probably should have been at this point a bit sooner. Having said that, I'm pleased that the department is at this place now. I think the context and scope is absolutely appropriate for where we are today. And I sense from the Secretary's remarks and from how this document is laid out, there's enough flexibility to continue to adapt, whether there be ideological or other targeted violence evolutions happen over the next 24 to 36 months.
Can I just follow up on that? So I completely agree with what you just said, and I completely disagree with Seamus. But this is
your turn now.
This is not going to transform the department in any other way because this is basically a public safety responsibility that DHS is executing, and in the space that it's operating, you're not going to be able to tell much of a difference between whether this is the array of the things we just talked about or a targeted violence thing. So it doesn't really dramatically require them to do things dramatically different than they were doing before. That's why it's a strategic framework and not a strategy. It's just saying we're doing exactly what you said. We're organizing this mission for the long term to make a constructive contribution to national public safety, most of which in this particular area is actually going to be done by state and local governments. I mean, to the point the Department of Homeland Security gives out fire grants. They've been doing that since day one. Yes. It hasn't changed. It hasn't turned fire departments into national security instruments, and it hasn't dragged the department into running state and local fire departments. So the history of the department and how they've addressed it to the dual mission of being a Homeland Security agency primarily responsible for dealing with transnational terrorism and providing a bunch of national public safety functions, many of them in support in state and local governments. They've done that, and they haven't drifted and transformed. So I just think history is against you. I think you're wrong.
So I'll give Seamus an opportunity to stand up for himself if he wants to defend
but
the
do it
sort of
sitting down.
proposition
Yeah,
that
no.
this is that this really is a radical
Jim
change.
completely convinced me. How novel in DC. No, I actually do think it changes. DHS is going to continue what DHS does. When we set it up when I was in Congress, 20 years ago, it makes sense. But But it does change in the actual implementation on some things. For example, the way you engage with tech companies on targeted violence is going to be different the way you deal with ideologically motivated violence in terms of that. It's going to radically change the way you deal or want to address countering violent extremism issues. I mean, will we see whether this is just a word and kind of an expansion a little bit, and whether this is just DHS moving on with the normal course of DHS. But if they did put down a marker, then you need to shift the way you approach it. And I think if you add the word targeted violence in there, you're putting down a marker.
Susan, can I make one last point on this? Sorry, one key point. General Allen made the point when asking the Secretary the question, what are the gaps and seams that exist? When we look at this issue in totality, whether it's the investigative lead of the Department of Justice and the FBI, their ability to prosecute, the core function of prevention as it's built out within the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the Department of Justice, and other state and local law enforcement and Homeland Security entities across the United States, that is still a seam and a gap to some extent that continues to be filled. This framework is an attempt to fill that gap in the prevention space because of the nature of the threat today. And so as we think about this issue, understanding, as the Secretary pointed out, there's an action plan that assigns roles and responsibilities, et cetera. That's a key component to making sure that gaps and seams on prevention, irrespective of its targeted violence or ideologically motivated violence, is absolutely the next reasonable conclusion that department should be taking. Sorry, Chad.
Yep. So I would agree and disagree with all my panelists.
Good work.
I would say, part of the strategic framework is to provide that leadership. And I think that's what the acting secretary is doing. I mean, we're here today talking about targeted violence, and what does that mean? We wouldn't have been up here 2 years ago talking about that. So I think there's a benefit to that. Second point, the acting secretary created the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention at the department, at the headquarters level, that helps, from an umbrella standpoint, pull together all the different pieces that the DHS and its components are doing, from CISA to Service to INA and others, and making sure that we're all pushing forward, with one united front. So I think there's actually a lot of benefit when we talk about targeted violence, and there is difference in how the department is approaching this, not only through the terminology and the lexicon, but also through the prevention mission. So I think it's somewhere in between.
And Jim, I want to sort of push you on this idea, or tease it out a little bit. So in your comments, you mentioned that DHS has been really, really successful and provided a lot of value in its mission, sort of directed at transnational terrorism organizations and events. I think it's safe to say the government operates in a world of limited resources, and even if additional resourcing comes, we still have limited resources. So if the sustained focus on the sort of transnational elements has had real value and done real work, and the department is now also saying they're going to shift into this new space, and resources aren't going to magically increase, how do you square that? Are you saying that they can do it all at the same time?
Yeah, but this is the genius of the all hazards approach, because the reality is the spaces that DHS are moving into are natural public safety support missions that they're already doing. So I agree that the value of and this is one of the, as we struggle with the organization and structure of the department over years and looked at reforms and everything else, the great challenge is how do you operationalize across these different entities and really bring effectiveness to all the things they can do? And again, I go back to the case of the Times Square bomber as a tremendous example, which couldn't have happened in the old days, right? Pre-DHS, you could have never gotten that information about who that person is in real time, and get it to the guy at the airport in LaGuardia to get the guy and then bring the FBI in. That just wouldn't have happened. And so the great challenge has really been synchronization across platforms to mimic capabilities. And I think that's exactly the point Chad gets to. What makes that happen? Leadership and focus and guidance. So I do think it's a question of leadership, focus, guidance, organization, not really a question of resources, because I really do think that's what the all hazards vote says. We can't have a separate fire department for terrorists and earthquakes, and fire departments and heart attacks and kittens up a tree. So we have one instrument which is capable of adequately supporting the needs of the community. And I do want to get into cyber at some point, so don't forget me.
All right, we will loop back into it. And actually, this is a perfect segue, because the question I planned to ask Seamus now was that another sort of element of this strategy is a note on the role of the internet in radicalization. This is something you've written a lot about. This is a document that specifically if briefly mentions places like 8chan and Gab.
Yep.
What is the role of DHS, on these platforms or more traditional social media platforms, sort of in addressing the threats that they're describing as emanating from these places?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the strategy, I think rightly has 3 points. The first is to engage with tech partners on this issue. The second is to support counter-messaging by non-governmental organizations. And the third, I think, and to DHS credit, a call out to support the First Amendment and protections on that. Those are all very valid approaches. And in fact, we've had a history of the last 5 to 10 years of engagement with tech companies on these issues. My concern is as these organizations are getting kicked off of more mainstream sites, the industry standards are going to be different. And so maybe 8chan doesn't want to take your phone call from the DNI or NCTC, right? And they have an incentive and a belief that the free speech wins overall, right? As opposed to Google, Twitter, or Facebook, which got hammered by the Hill and then decided to pull back, right? And so this is going to be very different than it was in the next 5 years. Especially as you go increasingly more niche sites like Telegram and 8chan.
Were you surprised to hear the acting secretary early in his comments with General Allen? I think I'm accurately characterizing, saying that he was commending Cloudflare on its decision, to remove services. Right, this is a controversial issue, sort of the notion of being able to deplatform these places through private actions. Should we understand that to be sort of a government endorsement of that? Is that a area in which we want to see the government taking action, or am I overreading his comment?
No, I don't think so. I mean, listen, every administration wants to put the finger on the scale every once in a while and not want, and then the lawyers tell you can't, right? When it comes to this, it makes sense that they would call for that, and they're going to have to balance this again. This third point, which is protect First Amendment, with isn't it great that Cloudflare put down the website? But the Obama administration did the same thing. Jim Clapper flew to Silicon Valley and told them they should take down most ISIS propaganda, and wouldn't you know that actually happened, right? And so every administration is going to do that. The question is whether it's a forcing function or you're just using the bully pulpit.
So before we sort of move to the cyber question that Jim wants to answer, Undersecretary Wolf, this strategy document talks a lot about law enforcement partnerships in a little bit of a vague way. The unnamed or not frequently named partner party is the FBI.
Right.
And so I'm curious, if you can sort of elaborate what is the role of the partnership, and how does this strategic framework change what sort of the relationship between places like DHS and the FBI and DHS and state and local governments is going to look like?
Well, first of all, we have a very strong relationship with them, and I think the framework talks about a number of ways that we can improve that relationship and improve the information sharing. So whether we're talking about again, our work with the social media companies and the larger platforms, DOJ and FBI are partners, as well as others in the interagency are partners in that discussion. DHS, to get back to the last question, DHS interacts with a lot of the social media companies, on a daily, weekly basis. And we do that a couple of different ways. We do that through the GIFCT, which is sort of an industry group that I believe they're going to be making some announcements next week at UNGA to sort of formalize that group. And we are certainly encouraging that and have been encouraging them to do that for some time. So we continue to talk with them about how to pull down content, terrorist-related content, quicker, faster. How do we provide off-ramps when appropriate? How do we do a number of other things, counter-messaging that the department's not really involved in, but the platforms are, along with NGOs and other private sectors. So we also, from a departmental standpoint, the department hosts a number of digital forums where we go into individual communities and we play sort of a collaboration between DHS, those tech companies that come into those communities, as well as local private NGOs that maybe not have that reach to a Facebook or to a Twitter or whoever. And we provide that link up, and they provide some solutions and start talking, and that dialogue continues. So that goes back to what we talk about as a community-based approach or a whole society approach. And so it's things like that where we can pull in the tech community and pull in the private sector that I think is really going to provide value over the next 2 to 3 years as we look at in the prevention space.
So that tees you up, Jim, to make the observations you want to about cyber.
A bit of a Debbie Downer here. Look, don't get too enamored in the rhetoric and the strategic framework about cyber, because the reality is DHS has virtually zero statutory authority over these agencies, over these private sector companies. They can't make them do anything, and they're not going to make them do anything, right? What DHS is going to do is, in some respects, what they've always done, which Chad just excellently described as, it's mostly an advisory role. They provide information and suggestions and best practices, and sometimes they use them effectively, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they actually tell DHS good stuff, and we use it effectively. So that's really business as usual, and the fact that they're bringing targeted violence into the discussion, that's all to the good. But honestly, that's business as usual. Where DHS is going to make a difference is in the dark web, which is really the most dangerous activity, because it's out of sight, and it's not just about radicalization, it's about where people can do things that are actually illegal and dangerous and get ready to kill people. And that's a space where DHS and FBI do have substantive authorities, and they can work effectively, and that is very effective on the preventative front. So that's the really good stuff. And just the last point to make is the center of gravity here is really the private sector actors, because we can all debate what the regulatory framework could be or should be or would be or whatever, and we'll debate that ad nauseum. But right now, the preponderance of authority of dealing with this really rests with the platforms themselves and what content they wish to host and not host. And what do we want out of a really good tech company? Well, we'd really like 3 things. One is, the one thing we love about the internet, it is a public square of free ideas, right? It is the most powerful tool for free expression and to create, share, enliven, and enrich ideas. And we'd hate to see that go away just because some Yahoo, wants to get on there and say, whatever. The other thing is it is one of the great engines of economic freedom, right? It has generated more wealth than anything. And we would hate to put strictures on that actually prevent people from getting on there and coming up with really cool ideas on how to make money. And the third thing is we would like a company that would actually not get our children killed, right? That they wouldn't get abducted by child rapists and or whatever other bad things. And okay, so which of those are really important? And the answer is we'd like all 3. We'd like a company that is as free as possible. We'd love a company that we can make tons of money, and we'd like to be safe. And the answer is striving to achieve all 3 has to be the goal of a good, responsible company. And the reality is, at the end of the day, despite whatever laws and everything else we want, they know more about their platforms than anybody else. Mm-hmm. They know their algorithms. They know their capabilities. They know how people exploit it. And I think the challenge for them is the challenge that I laid out before is we have a political debate where people would like political outcomes, and they'd be happy to hijack public safety to get their political outcome. And then we've got the mission of actually keeping people safe and keeping his daughter from being abducted and keeping his grandmother from losing all her money to some guy in Nairobi, right? And they've got to navigate that and step up with that, and they've got to have good, honest discussions with our lawmakers in the framework. They have to have good discussions with Chad and his folks, because when they partner together in trust and confidence, and they actually do things that put all of us first, as opposed to focusing on political agendas, they actually accomplish some really good stuff.
Two quick points, I would say. Sorry, George.
Go ahead.
Completely agree on the dark web, and there's a lot of great work that DHS is doing, and I could go on there. I would say it's business as usual from an authority standpoint. Right. I agree with you. Right. I would not say it's business as usual as far as a leadership standpoint.
Fair point.
There's a number of things that the department's done over the last 2 years, from really working with the social media companies that you see that are happening today, that has laid we laid the groundwork along with the interagency, has laid the groundwork to get them to a certain place. Do we think they can do more? Absolutely. But I think I wouldn't characterize it as business as usual of, it's what we've been doing day in and day out. So I do think there's been a lot of good work there. The authorities, yes. But I think the department will be the first one to stand up and say we need authorities.
Right. I mean, just wait. Some people respond and they say, "Oh my God, DHS is going to tell Twitter to take the blaze offline because terrorists like to read Twitter," and you're not going to do that, and you can't do that. That's my only point.
One addendum to the point that Jim and Chad made on the dark web: Christchurch, New Zealand, targeting Muslims; Poway targeting Jews; El Paso targeting Hispanic and Latinx immigrants. not the use of the dark web for planning, operation, or coordination. 8chan, a publicly available browser and web page that we can all go to. It's actually not up today, but like there is in fact problems on the dark web, but the open web too has a lot of stuff we should talk about.
Fair enough.
So Jib said that he was going to be a downer. George, I want to give you the opportunity to be a downer as well. You know, what we're describing here is an incredibly complex problem. You know, everybody on this stage has noted sort of strengths and weaknesses. What's missing from this document whenever we actually think about what the threat looks like and what changes are going to be needed to meet it? What do you not see in here?
What's missing is what the Secretary and Chad have alluded to in terms of the next steps. The next steps are the action plan for how are we going to take these priority actions that are carefully laid out throughout the document, and how are we going to execute those? And related, what's our M&E? What's our measurement and evaluation for knowing that we're doing a good job, and who in the department is accountable for driving that every single day and holding all the pieces and parts of this large organization accountable? And second, the associated funding. The Secretary alluded to the fact that there was an off-cycle request for additional resources. And so as we see the framework and we can evaluate the merits of is this the right layout and organization and construction, and then we get into the execution of it and associated resources, those two pieces are critical to knowing that if the document we're looking at today can be ultimately successful in the measurement, as he alluded to, in 12, 24, 36 months.
So Seamus, there's been formally a CVE program at DHS for a long time, using sort of some of the language we've seen here of sort of ideologically neutral or ideologically inclusive language. One critique of that program from the Obama administration on has been that that was the terminology being used. The reality was that those efforts were actually only being focused on one form of violent extremism, namely sort of Islamic extremism. Why shouldn't someone look at a document like this and say, this is more elaborate window dressing, it's sort of more going down the terminology, but we're going to see the same thing we've seen in prior administrations who've tried to sort of put their arms around this problem. Do you think this is something different, or how would you sort of respond to someone who would launch that type of critique?
No, I think ask me again in 6 months. When you look at if the action plan comes out and gives the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention the lead in a number of areas, if the allocation of resources on the Hill asks for a plus up on countering violent extremism grants, which are set to being zeroed out, if all of those things, right, that'll be the determining factor. We've seen both the Obama administration and the Trump administration a shrinking of personnel and resources towards this, and so if they're going to be serious about terrorism prevention, they're going to have to plus up.
So before I'll continue asking questions, but just sort of a last call for anyone who has note card questions to write those down and share it to the end, and we'll take time at the end to talk about it.
And just we're writing cards, so just come a CV comment. I thought the problem with the CV programs is they were wildly ineffective. And it wasn't that they were targeted on one group, it's that oftentimes the department was partnering with people which were actually fomenting extremism. So they were really crappy often about picking their partners. And I think there's a real question of the efficacy of the whole idea. And I thought it was a horrible place for the department to work. I think the department should get out of the ideology business. They're not well suited to that. They're a law enforcement agency. And I thought what the strategic framework describes about where the FBI and DHS partner great is their law enforcement agencies and those activities. And when they partner on the prevention and the response and the precursor activities themselves, that's a sweet space where they work very effectively. But broadly, having DHS kind of combat bad ideas is just a bad idea.
So as the person who ran that office and oversaw that grant program, I totally disagree. But Jim and I can have coffee afterwards, and I can make my case to him.
So we've mentioned resourcing and the importance of resourcing to take this from a strategic vision to an actual reality. What do those resources look like? Does DHS have what it needs? Is it able to get what it needs? Or is this all just sort of a nice idea and some leadership values, but a long way off from actually getting what you need to
And the acting secretary, sort of touched on it briefly. I don't think DHS is where it needs to be from a resource standpoint to really address the threat and everything that we've talked about today. I would say a couple of things. One, he's directed a number of actions to occur today. So without increasing resources or funding, all the folks from DHS that are in the audience, Secret Service, CISA, CRCL, and others, surging resources today. So we're just doing that sort of out of hide. That's not sustainable in the long term. So as he mentioned, he requested an out-of-cycle budget request for FY20. I can tell you that the department's leaning in on the FY21 request, currently working with OMB and others on that. So we hopefully that will turn out. But yes, that you will see more resources dedicated, at least from a DHS perspective, on the prevention side, as well as some of the other topics that we've touched on.
For you or for anyone on the panel, is it just a money problem, or is there also a need for new legislation, for new authorities' resources?
I'm going to pass on that one, but I'll let these guys.
I would argue, Jim may disagree, that that the nature of what we're talking about here is in some ways is a paradigm shift. It's not kind of the post 9/11 world as we know it. The world has changed. I mean, and the strategy alludes to this. The communications infrastructure, the speed and nature and scope of radicalization and mobilization is different today. And when you see 4chan, 8chan, Gab, when you see vitriolic, bigoted rhetoric packaged neatly next to bomb-making instructions on the open web, this is a threat environment that didn't exist a decade ago, per se. And it's changed, and it's a lot faster. And coupled with the nature of a hyper-polarized environment politically, it's a very combustible mix. And so the position that we're in today with the speed and rate of information packaged with this concept that many white supremacists refer to as accelerationism, like I need to do something today. I need to go into the synagogue, I need to walk into this Walmart and execute the threat against a white majority in this country. That's a very lethal combination that we see playing out. And so positioning, whether it's the federal government or state and local and community officials to address that is, I think, one of the paramount challenges that we will face for the years to come.
So I'll mention an area, and I think the Secretary mentioned, Chad, you might have mentioned it too, which is the adversarial use of drones domestically as a threat. We just had this situation with the attack on Saudi Arabia, a combination of 17 cruise missiles and drones, and a significant elevation in kind of of what you can do with drones and payloads, and that technology is proliferating rapidly. It's available domestically, and we're not there yet in terms of because largely this is a state and local problem, because we're not going to see drones with 1,000-mile ranges where you're going to launch a drone from Utah and we're going to hit the Capitol with it. We're going to see things that happen probably within the scope of 50, 100 couple of miles, and so it's largely going to be in the area of state and local governments, but a lot of that airspace is actually owned by FAA, and there are some regulatory issues there. We do have to kind of have a management system there, and at some point we have to empower state and local governments on how they can protect large venues and communities and everything else. And the private sector is going to bring on defensive technologies, and you don't want a defensive technology that jams and brings down the drone and also jams the entire emergency response network or the fire department, right? So there's a lot of stuff to be unpacked, and I am a little worried that I know we're working on it. I'm just a little worried that the other guys are going to work on it faster.
So there is a little bit of an elephant in the room anytime you're talking about a preventive law enforcement mission with a domestic focus that has an ideological element to it, right? Even though it encompasses many ideologies, and that elephant in the room is the First Amendment. One of the reasons why it's been difficult for the FBI and other law enforcement to be fully effective in this space is because there's not material support laws that sort of provide criminal predicate at an earlier stage. Should we be concerned about overreach here as we start to hear agencies like DHS that are focused on prevention, that are getting involved earlier in the cycle, focusing on these issues, focusing on what people are saying? Does that give anybody here sort of heartburn, or is that where the threat is, and so that's where we need to see DHS go?
Well, do remember, most of this is really going to fall on the shoulders of the private sector and state and local governments, and they're the ones that are going to have to deal with the legal issues, the liability, the issues of freedom of speech issues. So in some respects, it's like not DHS's problem, right? So, but you're right, is people have to be very thoughtful, not just how they work in this space, but how they communicate what they do in this space, because there are people on both sides that are terribly sensitive, right? There are conservatives, for example, who would say, anytime you mention this thing, what you're trying to do is to try, link me to some skinhead white supremacist, and that scares me. And on the other side, there are people that think, for example, every time you don't emphasize this, it means you don't really care about my synagogue, and everybody in there is going to die, right? And so it is both a public affairs, public speaking challenge for state and local and private sector, and a very significant management challenge as well.
So,
I'll just continue and then George.
Okay. Yeah, obviously this is a difficult issue for the department, and it's why we are very specific when we talk about the issue and identifying folks that are radicalizing to violence. Right. So radicalization and on the internet and doing what you want. That's not what we're focused on. It's the violence part that we are extremely focused on. It's also what you'll see in the strategic framework time and time again as a community-based or whole society approach. So a lot of what we do is providing resources, training, people, and intelligence at times to those local communities. Those are the individuals, those are the groups that are going to see folks that perhaps are prone to radicalization to violence first. It's not going to be DHS officials out in the field. There's never going to be enough of that. So a lot of what we do from a departmental perspective is different from what DOJ does. They prosecute, they investigate, they do that. We're more, again, on the preventative side. We have some protection activities as well, but more on the preventative side and working with the local folks to do that.
making Homeland Security policy that's data-informed and data-driven is critical. Right. Two pieces of legislation to call out, Susan, to answer your question. The Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, I think, helps us get closer to making policy that's data-informed and data-driven, as well as the Data Act, another element to get a more wide spread accounting of hate crimes and bias-motivated crimes. Currently, there are dozens of cities across the country with populations of 100,000 people or more that affirmatively report zero hate crimes or bias-motivated crimes in their communities. So as we think about really assessing this, in coupling with an annual threat assessment coming out of DHS, those two pieces of legislation help get us to better inform data-driven policy.
The short answer for your question is yes. Listen, I know what international terrorism is. I know what domestic terrorism is. I know what targeted violence is because I read a 1995 report, right? But it's not a lexicon in DHS, right? It's an understanding maybe in HHS and things like that. So if you introduce a new term of art in there, you're going to have overreach in some nature as people try to figure out what the right and left latitudes are of that. So yes, it should be a concern.
Can I just, so it's not strictly a quantitative problem. I mean, go back to your original statement, well, more people die from domestic terrorism than foreign terrorism, right? Which is interesting, but belies the point that what the foreign terrorists are trying to do is far more expansive and have in scope maybe more capabilities. And the reason why the foreign terrorist maybe has gone down is actually because the department's actually doing a really good job. And that's perhaps why domestic terrorism seems like more significant in respect. So I don't see it as, I don't disagree with you. I completely agree with you. We ought to have data, and it ought to be data informed. But the department's in the business of risk. Risk is threat, vulnerability, and criticality, right? And that's not a strictly quantitative measure. And so they have to think about what's the best to protect the nation as a whole. I want to applaud the department, and Seamus is exactly right. Good for you for doing a national threat assessment, right? Because they tried doing a national risk assessment, which was the stupidest activity any human being could think of, because you cannot measure national risk, right? Because you can't define vulnerability in a way that really, really makes sense. I mean, so you can write a report and say this is a national risk assessment, but it's a lie because you really can't pull all that stuff together in a way that's competent. But you can define threats in a way that makes sense and touch on the quantitative issues, which ought to be data-driven, but also looking at the intent of the adversaries, what their goals are, and that's a much more reasonable and achievable project, and I applaud the department for doing that.
Agree.
So we'll turn to questions, and if anybody has them and wants to pass them to the end, please do so now. So this question is, in the internet age, if you censor one platform, another will pop up. Government-sanctioned or forced censorship seems like an un-American and ineffective action. Is this view addressed in this strategy planning?
We certainly touch on, obviously, the role that social media platforms and the tech community writ large. As been mentioned on stage here, it's not DHS's role alone to police the internet. That's not what we do. DOJ, FBI, and others certainly have a role when they talk about investigating any type of companies, to include the tech companies. So that's not really what the department's doing. We're certainly much more in a partnership with these tech companies to talk about how they're, again, able to pull down content. We're not looking to censor or regulate at this time, but how do they pull down the content? How do they provide the offering? Are they doing enough? And I think what we have seen over the particularly the past 2 years, if you go back 2 years, I think there was I think the consensus in government was that not nearly enough is being done in this space. We're not seeing a collaborative approach, and we want to see more. And I think over the past couple of years, we've seen that. We want to continue to work with them. We think more can be done. And as I indicated earlier, I think the announcement next week, I think, is a step in the right direction, and we hope to see more along those lines.
I would also say, I mean, despite my boyish good looks, I'm not a huge believer in the idea of internet radicalization, right? Of course, these guys are online because the average age is 28, and so they're online, but they're online next to their best friend in the same room watching Anwar al-Awlaki videos. And so, if you look at if you pull down the cases, it's really also an in-person network. I mean, there's a reason why 5,000 folks left from Europe and only 250 left from the U.S. to go join the Islamic State. It's because there was an in-person network that worked out. And so I think we sometimes focus on the online environment because it's the most overt manifestation of the threat, and it's frankly, if I'm a congressional staffer, it's the easiest thing to do. Tech companies, you take care of this problem, as opposed to DHS, here's new grants, money, measures of effectiveness, and this is how you're going to do counter-violent extremism programs. That is all hard and political and things like that, where it's an easy win to go to tech companies and say, just take down the internet.
Seamus' point is really important. It shouldn't be missed.
All right.
No, really. There are, I'll give you another good example is India, right, where there's massive, and very, very little radicalization. And because, people look at the mass of the content and then they say, oh, that's the problem. But what we've seen over and over and over again, where a social network is influence is where it's connected to a human network underneath that. If there's no human network underneath that, occasionally you get a Christchurch or some other Yahoo, but you're not going to see that organized campaign of violence, and that's the real danger. And so I think sometimes we make a big mistake if we focus on this and we ignore that, because if there's no human work, most of that social stuff's not really going to accomplish anything. I just want to make one quick point to say what Chad said in just very blunt terms. They can't censor anybody. They don't have the regulatory to do that, right? And I think one of the things we have to be really sensitive from is there are groups on the right and the left who are concerned that this is going to evolve into censoring political free speech and marginalizing their ability to express themselves. And that's why I think it's incredibly important that we be very precise and clear that whatever you're doing is not a threat to that, because they're going to believe that. And even when you tell them clearly that it's not, they're still going to believe that. And so we just have to be very, very careful about what we say we're actually doing here, because and you cannot go to people and say your concerns aren't legitimate, because there are conservatives that have been kicked off networks and they do feel like they're being censored. And just telling them, no, you're just a Yahoo, that doesn't really make them feel any better.
Agree.
So the next question is, can you elaborate on the framework's approach to emerging technology issues, particularly unmanned aerial systems?
Sure. The strategic framework does touch on UAS and how we counter UAS. We have a program office in the policy offices to help coordinating the authorities that the Congress so aptly gave the department, I believe, last year to counter the UAS threat. It is a threat. We see it in a variety of different environments, both from the border, but also elsewhere. Secret Service and others have been involved in the threat and how to counter the threat for some time. So we see it manifesting, and we certainly see it as an emerging risk, both an emerging technology, and how do we address that? So DHS has some very limited authority. So I think part of what we talk about when we talk about UAS is trying to level set where the department is and what we can and can't do. Aside from the service, who has discrete authorities, the department has some very, I would say, limited authorities that we are undertaking as it relates to DHS covered facilities and assets, but as well as some of sort of the mass gatherings that we look at. So this strategic framework certainly touches on that. That's a big component as we look ahead down the line of where do we need to put our resources. And we talked about budgeting and resourcing, and as we look ahead to FY20 is kind of past us from a budgeting standpoint, but as we look ahead to 20 and 2021, 22 and beyond, how we bolster the department's CUAS capabilities is part of that conversation.
Does anyone else have thoughts on that part of the framework? So sort of, we're getting close to the end of time here. This is not, it's a new focus, but it's not an entirely new thing for a big federal agency to shift its focus and to add something else into its mission and to unveil big strategic frameworks. We've done it in the past. What are the lessons learned, particularly as we look sort of on DHS's track record over the, with respect to the transnational terrorism threat? What are the things that, as you shift your focus to this domestic set of issues, mistakes, lessons learned, what are you taking from that? Or should be?
I'll start having run one of the offices that was doing this work early on at DHS. And to Jim's point, even though I disagree with his premise that this was a bad idea, it was flawed from the get-go, that tells me that the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security, can do a better job of explaining what it does, why it does it, and how it came to those conclusions. There's room for the federal government writ large, DHS specifically, to improve the way that it provides transparency to the American public, that it engages with its citizens, that we kind of roll out different programs and initiatives. There's always room to do that better. Some of those lessons I learned the hard way, as Jim rightfully points out, and I think the department is taking some steps in this framework to make its framework, to make the appropriate priority areas more public, more engaging. And my hope is that conversations like this happen in cities and states across the country with a diverse set of local leaders who can engage in thoughtful conversations about how to apply and how to engage with the department.
I think you have to stay in your core competencies and stay focused on the mission. Because the reality is as somebody really is happy to say, oh my God, this is so awesome, they're dealing with targeted violence. Tomorrow, some city will sink beneath a hurricane and the department will be excoriated because they were focused on targeted violence and they ignored the hurricane, right? Or we're going to be focused on targeted violence and tomorrow there'll be a 9/11 and the first article that's going to be written is, well, that's because Department of Homeland Security was asleep at the switch. They were focused on worried about some skinhead and they were ignoring Al-Qaeda and that's why we all died, right? So you cannot win that fight. They cannot win that fight. All they can do is do their job within their core competencies and focus on the mission. But your point's exactly right, and that was the point I was trying to make too, is we'd be an idiot to recognize that this isn't surrounded by politics, and the department has an extra obligation to speak with clarity and consistency, often, even when people aren't listening, trying to explain, we are doing a risk-informed public safety mission to the best of our ability with the people that we have, even as people yell at them that you're just a bunch of, you're running concentration camps or whatever. That's all they can really do. And I do kind of applaud them for, trying to on this effort, at least initially, try to kind of explain that and lay that out. So good for them. But it's a tough job.
I would say I think this framework marries up well with the White House's national counterterrorism strategy, and I think understandably so, given where the NSC process is, that DHS in some ways got out in front of an implementation plan for the national CT strategy, and I think in many ways laid down a marker. And so in order for this policy to be effective, there's going to have to be an interagency process for this because the fact that DHS does CT work that in many ways marries up with FBI and DOJ, they're going to need them to sign off. Mm-hmm. And the only way you sign off is a national kind of White House implementation plan. And so I applaud DHS for getting out in front and saying this is what we're going to do, but the rest of the interagency is going to have to fall in line.
So I would say we're engaged in those conversations with the interagency, so I would agree with that. I would also agree with James's point that the department has a PhD in criticism, so I appreciate that. We deal with that every day. For back to your question though, what's changed or what are the markers? I think the proof is in the pudding. So as I think maybe Seamus mentioned, in 6 months from now, what does this look like? And what has the department done and how has it positioned itself? But I do want to caution when we talk about resources and we talk about what more can the department do, that's not going to show up overnight. That's not going to even show up perhaps in 6 months from now. So we're a budget cycle off and a fiscal year off, so that's going to have to catch up unless something dramatic happens. I will say one of the lessons learned is early on we pulled in particularly because of the nature of the topic that we're talking about. When we talk about First Amendment, we talk about domestic terrorism, pulling in our experts at the department on privacy and CRCL, I think was critical in understanding the concerns that they hear from their communities, respective communities, and building that into the framework. And that was something that the acting secretary made a priority. So we did that early on. I don't know that the department's always been best at that, but that is reflected in this document as well.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.